Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Educators are critical partners in making a difference in the lives of children of incarcerated parents. My name is Katie McDermott, and I will be handling the technical moderation for this event. Please note that all participant lines are muted and will remain muted throughout the course of the presentation. However, if you have a question at any time, feel free to type into the chat box located on the right side of your screen. The webinar presenters will receive your questions throughout the webinar, and they will try to get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A session of today's event. Near the beginning of today's webinar, we will ask participants to respond to a polling question. A box with multiple choice questions will appear on your screen, and you will be able to choose one answer by simply clicking the circle next to the response. At the close of the webinar, you will be directed to a short feedback form. Please take a minute to complete the brief survey to give us your feedback regarding today's webinar. Note that this form will open in a new browser window outside of GoToMeeting. You will need to disable all pop-up blockers in order to view and complete the form. This presentation is being recorded and will be archived for future access. You will receive an email in the coming days with a link to the archived presentation. And at this time, I will introduce our facilitator, Juliette Marie D'Souza.
Thanks, Katie. Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on how school staff can make a difference in the lives of children with an incarcerated parent. This webinar is brought to you by the American Institutes for Research on behalf of the Federal Interagency Reentry Council subgroup on children of incarcerated parents. The Reentry Council works to remove federal barriers to successful reentry so that individuals are able to compete for a job, attain stable housing, support their children and their families, and contribute to their communities. The Council has 12 subgroups, one of which is focused on children of incarcerated parents. My name is Juliette Marie D'Souza. I co-manage AIR's work with the Reentry Council. Today's webinar will discuss data about and the experiences of children with an incarcerated parent in order to provide background information and context for school staff and others working with these children. We'll also talk about information about working with children with an incarcerated parent in the school and other settings when the educator or provider may or may not be aware of the parent's incarceration. And we will discuss resources that are available to help teachers, school staff, and others who work with children who have an incarcerated parent. We will hear from two experts in the field, an educator, and a youth with the lived experience of having an incarcerated parent. We will have time at the end for questions and answers, and you are invited to submit your questions in the chat box at any time. We have received some questions via email already. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and you can email questions to youth.gov@air.org after the webinar. We are fortunate today to have four speakers, the first of which will be Anne Adelist-Estrin. Anne will be providing an overview for all of us about the topic. She is the director of the National Resource Center on Children and Families of the Incarcerated at Rutgers University, where she also teaches in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice. Under Anne's leadership, NRCCFI has provided training and consultation to government and non-government agencies and community programs across the U.S. and internationally. She is also a consultant to the Echoes of Incarceration video projects and is the author of several publications. In 2013, she was honored at the White House as a champion of change for her work as an advocate for children and families of the incarcerated. She will be followed by Dr. David Osher, an AIR Vice President and Institute Fellow. David will talk about the whole school approaches of using trauma-informed approaches when working with all students, including children of incarcerated parents. David's day-to-day work focuses on multiple topic areas, including collaboration, children's services, prevention, social-emotional learning, school climate, and youth development. David serves as the principal investigator of 3 major research and technical assistance centers funded by the U.S. government, and also serves as the principal investigator for the contract for this work with the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs. David consults with ministries, non-governmental agencies, educators, and human service professionals around the world. He serves on numerous expert panels and editorial boards and has authored or co-authored over 300 books, monographs, chapters, articles, and reports. David will be followed by the Reverend Dwight Davis. Dwight will give us an on-the-ground educator's perspective of working with all youth, including those with parents who are incarcerated. Dwight is a 10-year veteran teacher and a proud product of the District of Columbia Public Schools. For the past decade, Dwight has served Wheatley Education Campus as a 5th grade teacher, English and language arts coach, a home visits coordinator, and teacher lead. He now serves as the assistant principal of Wheatley. He partners with parents and the community in an effort to continue to raise achievement levels. Prior to his teaching career, Dwight played both professional and semi-professional basketball within the U.S. and abroad. He has published book chapters and has written several op-eds for the Huffington Post. And then finally, we will hear from Kendall. Kendall is our youth voice, and he will share his personal experiences with us. Kendall is a graduate of the U.S. Dream Academy, which he started in the 5th grade when his grandmother enrolled him after she got him and his sister out of foster care and legally adopted them. With the ongoing guidance of the staff at the Dream Academy and his mentor, Kendall worked hard to learn to cope with the trauma, shame, and anger he was experiencing at that time as a result of the many challenges he had faced in his life, including abuse and the arrest and incarceration of his parents. Over the past 4 years, Kendall has been an advocate for mentoring children of incarcerated parents and underserved youth. He uses his experiences of being in the foster care system and the impact of family incarceration as a platform to inspire other young people to overcome adversity. He has shared his story on Huffington Post Live, KTSU Radio, and as a speaker at the 2014 National KIPP Summit. He also represented Dream Kids at the White House for a forum on mentoring children of incarcerated parents, where he shared with congressional representatives and high-level White House officials the impact of mentoring on his life. He is currently a freshman at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas, where he is majoring in sociology. So these bios, more detail on their bios, and a tip sheet for teachers are available for download during this webinar and afterwards. As Katie mentioned, we would like to start with a quick polling question so that we can learn who we have on the line today. So on your screen in a moment, you will see the options. If you would quickly choose the option that best represents who your role and who you work for. Okay. And we see some of the results are coming in. We'll give folks a few more seconds.
So we don't see.
Okay, so it looks like almost so far, we don't have everyone in yet, but so far we have almost half of the people, or 40% of the people, are teachers, principals, or other school staff. We have about 20% as community providers or working within the child welfare organization world, and almost 30% are in other related fields. So I think since we have limited time, we'll let the poll continue, but I'm going to turn it over to Anne, who will start us off.
Thank you so much, Juliet. I am thrilled to be able to do this webinar. We at NRCCFI have done a tremendous amount of training over the last couple of decades in schools around the country, and I've learned so much from the teachers and counselors, from even the bus drivers and cafeteria workers, and certainly from the families and young people that we gather together for those trainings. So I'm really happy to be able to share a lot of that with you today. I always start out by a quick check, asking people to think and reflect for a moment about how they would finish these sentences. The best thing that would happen or could happen to the children of incarcerated parents is, and the worst thing that could happen. And you know, we get a lot of different answers. I think a lot of people who are drawn to disciplines that work with children, serve children, care for children, tend to say things like the best thing that could happen is the kids get really good support, that they are not treated any differently than other kids, that they don't experience shame and stigma. And the worst thing that could happen is that they, really the opposite, that they don't get the support, but also that they don't follow in their parents' footsteps, or that they're not wrongly accused of things. And I just want to share that all of those things are important, but what often, and probably most often, the kids say is the best thing that could happen is that their parent come home and able to parent them well, and that the worst thing is that they would die in prison. And I think it reflects the fact that often we are thinking of things related to helping kids manage away from their parents, and sometimes, and often maybe, kids are thinking about ways in which they wish they could have a better relationship with that parent. So the most important skill and the guiding principle for me, number one, is to be self-reflective. We really can't do this work unless we're asking ourselves pretty regularly, what lenses are you wearing when you think about this topic? What's your perspective? And I'll weave that into this presentation quite a bit. And I'm going to go through my slides quickly, and they're available to you so that you can delve into some of the information more closely on your own time. The first thing I want to say, though, is how we know what we know, because in the last decade we've seen a tremendous amount of increase in information about children of incarcerated parents. And so, you know, we do know that we do know that we get a lot of information from data collection, but we're still trying to figure out how to do that. We don't count heads, so we're doing random samplings. We're using data that's collected by some departments of corrections, by some departments of child welfare. We rely heavily on anecdotal and programmatic and clinical chronicles and the experiences of families. But probably most importantly, the meaning that gets made of any of this research by everyone who reads it, implements it, and then does program and policy development is really significant. So what we do know, and it is an estimated number, is that including prisons and jails, there's 2.7 million children that have a parent that are behind bars on any given day. And it is an estimated number because, as I said, we're not counting heads. We're doing random samplings and using a formula to figure out an estimated number. And from those formulas and random samplings, we found that over 50% of children with an incarcerated parent are age 9 or younger, which has some really significant implications for program development. And we also know that caregivers are by and large the other parents. Since most of the incarcerated parents are men, most of the children are living with their mothers. And then, you know, the graph shows the other types of caregivers that children have. And I wanted to just put in here some excellent resources on ethnographic resources and experiences of families that really help us to dig in and get some depth about what families are experiencing through this process. We also know what we know through some studies that are gaining a lot of attention right now and are very helpful to us, one being the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that looks at those negative health and behavioral outcomes that seem to be stemming from certain experiences in childhood, and having an incarcerated household member is one of those experiences, and that's very significant. I think it's significant because of trauma, and we're not yet doing a good enough job at connecting the trauma literature with the literature on adverse childhood experiences and children of incarcerated parents specifically. But what we do know about trauma is that it affects the executive functioning brain development in a way that causes impulse control problems and emotional regulation that leads to the poor school performances and increased dropout rates and gang involvement and other kinds of negative outcomes. And if we rely on that trauma literature and we expand it a little bit to think about what folks are saying about younger children. For instance, Victor Carrion at Stanford University says that since young children have great difficulty understanding about death, that the sudden loss of a parent to incarceration or to any other situation could create a cortisol surge or trauma in the same, to the same extent that being held at gunpoint would for other adults. And so now we're needing to start thinking about what the meaning that's made of some of the research and the connections between, I'm having trouble moving my slides because of the Oops, I'm sorry, folks. I'm having trouble moving my slides because
we'll take over moving the slides for you, Ann.
When the poll keeps popping up, it interferes with my moving the slides.
Yeah, we're closing the poll, and we can move the slides for you.
Okay. Right, and I can't move them, so I'm not going to be able to see them. I apologize about this. I'll be with you in 1 second.
Which slide would you like to start with, the seeking equilibrium?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so what we also know is that as kids deal with stress and trauma, they are looking for equilibrium through dopamine surges. And one of the things that's fascinating is that young children really do need their primary attachment figures as a buffer from that stress and trauma. And as if that's not hard enough, you know, the Harvard Center on Child Development looking now at toxic stress being stressful situations in families and communities over long periods of time, creating some of the same outcomes as a specifically traumatic event would. And again, meaning making is important. So when you look at the ACE study through the lens of child maltreatment, which some folks really are doing, and if doing that says that the incarcerated parents maltreated their children, if that's the meaning you make and the assumptions that they are harmed by their parents and better off without them, it has policy implications. But if you look at parents incarcerated as potential buffers from the toxicity, and therefore a different meaning is made of the loss, it becomes more profound and less dismissible. So guiding principle number 2 is when you read the research, always ask yourself, why could that be? And not just say, oh, I see, okay, so perhaps there's more antisocial behavior because of social learning theory, or kids are imitating their parents, but what about trauma and the impact of trauma? I also want to say that, you know, we ask ourselves a lot, you know, are these just kids? And they, of course, are. Manuel Larti says that we all, as humans, and I borrow this quote, are just like everyone else, like some others, and like no others but ourselves, because each person manages this situation in their own way. So guiding principle number 3 is that children of incarcerated parents are not one monolithic group. There's lots of themes and variations, and therefore there's no one monolithic solution. The combined sources of much of the research is, though, pointing to the unique stress, toxic stress levels of parental incarceration, the stigma and shame, the conspiracy of silence, changes in residence, difficulty maintaining a relationship, fear and worry, lack of relevant support, and relevant is the operative word because its supports are, not relevant to their lives. It's much more difficult. And again, the meaning that we make, if we think that kids are experiencing stigma and shame because they're ashamed of their parents, which a lot of people do believe, the kids will often say that the shame comes from the reactions of the people around them, not so much that they're ashamed of their parents, but their shame is coming out of and resulting from the reactions and the things that people say. So P, a 13-year-old, said that when people ask about my father, I know that if I tell them he's in prison for drugs, they'll either drop me in the conversation and talk about the weather or give me this big picture lecture about how I don't have to turn out like him. And I hate both of those things, so I lie and say that he died. I think that it's important to know whether a child witnessed the arrest of a parent because that can often create even more trauma or intensified trauma. I think we need to consider the embedded issues of racism in the system and the fact that 2/3 of the incarcerated parent population is non-white. I think Kristen Turney's study that looks at health is very helpful to us. And if you look at this particular slide, it's noticeable that there's a huge difference between having an incarcerated parent and not having an incarcerated parent for health issues that are stress-related. But things like diabetes and epilepsy and bone and joint and vision problems, not so much. And so we can really trace this issue of trauma and stress to health as well as behavioral issues. So in wrapping up, the role of schools and all of the staff within schools is very important. People want to know, why is this different? It's different because of the trauma and the unique aspect of the shame and stigma and lack of relevant supports. But David Satcher said that risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors, and I think that's a really important quote. So if we recognize that people, skills, and a sense of faith and emotional competence are protective, and we recognize that caregivers and the children's caregivers are protective factors, but we do have a modest amount of research that helps us understand their hardships, and that, not having access to a parent minimizes the buffers, and what meaning do we make in terms of including incarcerated parents as protective factors? In one study last year on visiting and reactions to visiting, 56% of children responded negatively after a visit and 44% responded positively based on caregiver reports. And so some people would say, well, then we shouldn't have kids visiting their parent, but I would say most kids would respond with an upset reaction after seeing a parent that they haven't seen in a long time. And we need to be really careful about how we interpret the research and the policy and practice that flow from that. Dallaire and her colleagues' study that looked at teacher bias, I think, is very important to really look at, because I think hypothetically, when hypothetical situations were presented to teachers, they did have a reaction to children with incarcerated parents that showed a bias related to school performance and behavior that was different than other kids. So what you can do in schools: know yourself, refer respectfully, apply trauma-informed practice, use universal outreach instead of just thinking, well, this child may have an incarcerated parent. If you can say, if incarceration is an issue for your family, we can help in counselors' offices and in the school library. It's a universal approach to outreach. displaying materials, including information about incarceration in curriculum for children, help children talk about it, but also maintaining confidentiality, and then the sort of traditional things like support groups. Also involving the incarcerated parent in IEP meetings where that's appropriate, and promoting awareness and reflecting on the policies of your schools. Also finding and partnering with programs that in your community that do work with children of incarcerated parents. Encourage the use of accurate and helpful statistics. I'm sure many of you have seen that 7 out of 10 children of incarcerated parents will end up in the criminal justice system, which we know is an inaccurate statistic. And Jim Conway's article, 7 out of 10, not even close, will help understand that, sort of false research a little bit better. And always include children of the incarcerated and their caregivers in discussing, defining the problem, and designing the solutions. Echoes of Incarceration films are great for bringing the stories of the kids and their families to meetings, to PTA meetings, etc. It's very important. They always say that they're only included as the sad story or the warm-up act instead of in any substantive way. And so I want to end with, don't let what you can't do interfere with what you can do, because there's a lot you can't do as educators, but there really is a lot that can be done to minimize the stigma and support these kids in classrooms. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn the baton over to David Osher, who's going to talk about his work with kids and risk factors in children of incarcerated parents.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ann, for a very, very helpful presentation, and good afternoon to everybody. I want to build on Ann's points about trauma and focus on the fact that because there are many young people who experience adversities that they may experience traumatically, that in addition to trying to explicitly serve the identified needs of young people whose parents are incarcerated, you may get more mileage by building an environment that is trauma sensitive and therefore works for many young people who experience trauma, so that even if you are not able to identify a young person whose parents are incarcerated, you will be providing him or her with some of the support that they need, and I'll talk about those elements. And let me just add one thing about trauma. I mean, trauma tends to really bring two impacts. One is, as Ann says, it compromises people's behavior. It really affects regulation. You tend to be hypervigilant and things like that. It also often compromises people's relationship skills, because in different ways people have been betrayed. Maybe they experience as young people being betrayed by an adult who they're close to, or maybe it's people around them, like the people who took their parents away. But young people whom we are dealing with are often people who also need support in developing social relationships and so forth. So let me give you some bottom lines that work for children whose parents are incarcerated, but also work for other vulnerable children. One is to build assets and protective factors. And what I mean by assets are things that young people can take with them. So for example, when we develop children's social and emotional competencies, we are giving them ways of self-regulating their behavior that they can use not just in school, but also in the street. And also build protective factors that buffer the challenges that they face. And at the same time, reduce or eliminate risk factors. And to build on what Ann said, on the one hand, any given risk factor and any given ACE is not necessarily going to mean that a child is going to realize a bad result. But what we know from ACE research, what we know for research on risk factors, is the more risk factors you have, the more likely you're about to realize a bad outcome, and that risk factors often accumulate. And at the same time, what we know about protective factors and assets is that the more protective factors and assets you have, the more likely you're able to succeed. So the name of the game ultimately is to do both. But if we're thinking about school, and we can think about other settings as well, a key is building the capacity and proficiencies of school staff and of the schools and of the systems, and I think you'll hear from Dwight on those, to really serve children of incarcerated parents and other vulnerable children well. People go into schools because they want to do good. They don't go into schools for other reasons. But people need a capacity to do good. And when you're working with kids who challenge you, and when you're working in challenging situations, and when your life is challenging, and when the children whom you work with may evoke and provoke from you responses in part because maybe you've experienced trauma in the past, you really need an environment that can help you do it. So it's not just about thinking good, it's about creating a capacity to do good. And that certainly includes very much the type of self-awareness that Ann talks about, which includes being aware of implicit bias. Because to go back to the racial issues that have come here, we also know that across the country from scientific research, there are implicit biases that relate to how people react to not just children whose parents are incarcerated, but children of color, male children of color most particularly, and those are things that people need to be self-aware of and to be able to address. Next slide, please. It's also important to use universal trauma-sensitive approaches within a multi-tiered system of support. And why I'm using the word trauma-sensitive and not informed, it's not just to wait until you know that a child has experienced a particular type of trauma. You don't want to ignore it if you know that. But you're never going to be able to identify every kid who's traumatized. And if you do go through an identification process, you may really have the risks of self-fulfilling prophecies and teacher bias and low expectations that Ann raised. And so what you want to do is build into the entire fabric of the school and what it's doing a trauma-informed approach. What's also important for all students, but particularly students who are vulnerable, is to build conditions for learning. And that includes them feeling emotionally as well as physically safe. They're feeling connected to the school and to their classmates and to their teachers and supported by them. Them feeling the fact that they are being stretched and challenged, but they're being supported academically to be there, and also ultimately for them to be surrounded by other peers and teachers who model good social and emotional competence. And what's also part of what we have to do if we want to do it is to employ approaches to learning and development that are strengths-based. That means looking at a child and looking at a child's family and identifying strengths as well as trying to build them, that are child and youth-centered, that are youth and family-driven. And I think Dwight will probably talk about that more, but to be driven means that you really need to be in the shoes of the people you're trying to really listen to. And that includes parents of incarcerated youth who are very important to the youth, as we've heard about, and to be culturally competent and culturally proficient. And that's not just about color, it's not just about language, it's about social class as well, and it's about understanding that there are many subcultures within communities. Next slide, please. Schools can really contribute to the well-being of children of incarcerated parents and other children when they provide safety, when they provide for young people a preparedness and a realistic sense of competence. And that includes the skills that you develop in students' competencies, again, like social and emotional competencies, like the ability to self-manage. Building dispositions like a growth mindset, understanding the fact that I can do something. Things are not totally fixed. And providing young people with experiences that they can build upon. Providing connectedness. Providing a sense of engagement in the activities that are going on in the class and in the school, and providing a healthy and health-supporting environment. I got to tell my colleagues right now, you've gone off the slide. I don't know where we are right now.
We're gonna get it back. I think that's what she's trying to locate, the proper slide here.
Okay, may I have the next slide now? Okay, and there are 4 components that I think you want to think about if you're going to be supporting conditions for learning that are particularly important for children who are vulnerable, and probably most particularly for children whose parents are incarcerated. One is a bucket that includes not just connection, but feeling attached, feeling trust, experiencing care, experiencing respect over and over again, experiencing social emotional learning, learning some skills and support, being in an environment that employs positive behavioral approaches, that proactively does things to try to make sure that things work for me well, by using data, by being proactive, and being in an environment that supports my ability to learn through effective pedagogies that are also culturally responsive, through making sure that I'm engaged, by really building my motivation. Next slide. And if you please go down through everything, very quickly, schools can both be protective factors that supports the resilience of young people whose parents are incarcerated, by supporting their connection, by supporting their academic success, by supporting transitions that they experience. And if you think about school systems when kids are moving, that support their transitions as well, by supporting caring interactions between and among students and families, by providing social and emotional learning, by providing stability for young people whose lives are often unstable, by, when students act out, providing positive approaches to disciplinary infractions, and providing young people with appropriate services and supports. And that's what I hope Dwight will be telling us how Wheatley's trying to do things. But now let's look at some of the neighbor schools to Wheatley. And if I can have the next slide, please. And again, let's go through them. What you don't want, because if you remember, risk factors accumulate, well, schools can be an additional risk factor, the one that may make the difference between success and failure. A place where students experience alienation, academic frustration, chaotic transitions between classes, negative relationships with adults like sarcasm, being shouted at, and peers, being bullied, being teased. Places where they experience gangs, poor adult role modeling, adults losing control and being counter-aggressive, and using their power to punish somebody rather than acting in a supportive way. Being segregated with other students who are perceived to be antisocial. We have lots and lots of scientific data that suggests that in most cases when you put kids who have behavioral problems together with other kids who have behavior problems, you get bigger behavior problems, not the opposite. By having school-driven mobility, moving me around the class, moving me between classes, moving me into a special room, getting rid of me from one school and putting me in another one, and the experience of harsh discipline, suspension, expulsion, push out, and drop out. And in some schools in D.C., but in every big city and in small cities across the country, there are humongous numbers of kids who experience exclusionary discipline, often harsh, and most particularly kids of color, but also often kids who have been traumatized. And this is part of the process that affects young children. Next slide, please. The point here is that it's just that the fact that the issues I've talked about work for all kids, but they particularly work for young kids who have experienced trauma like children of incarcerated parents. Next slide, please. If we want to do it, and I've been talking largely about that blue, the foundation, what we really want to have is a foundation that provides prevention and youth development approaches and care and climate and positive approaches and personalized instruction and cultural competence and strong family involvement. And the foundation in a place like Wheatley is going to have to be stronger than if you're moving to a suburb. But no matter what, you want a foundation because that's going to make it easier to implement a multi-tiered approach. It's going to make it easier to identify the young people who may have greater needs, and that may be when you find out that someone's parents are incarcerated. And if you're intervening early, what it's going to happen is you're going to reduce the need for those young people who need very, very intensive interventions. But in addition, because of the fact that people are in an environment that's more healthy, where the temperature is lower, then what's going to happen is the fact that kids who are receiving intensive interventions are more likely to succeed because their peers are going to support their wellness rather than undermine their wellness. Next slide. And I've already talked about this, and so let's go to the next slide. So next slide, please. Unfortunately, there are many people in this country who really don't buy into the needs of incarcerated kids. Kids whose parents are incarcerated, particularly if they're black or Latino or First Nation. And yet the challenge is we have to be able to provide the support universally. And I would suggest that the way we can do it is to really talk about the fact that while we want to address the particular needs of children whose parents are incarcerated, like making sure parents can participate in IEP meetings, as Ann has suggested, we want to be able to talk about creating an environment that works for all young people who are vulnerable. Young people who have experienced fear or loss because a parent or grandparent has died, whose parents are deployed in the military, who have just had to move from a different place, maybe a different country, who've experienced trauma in the community, as well as young people whose parents are incarcerated. And when you add all of them together, then you start to have a need to serve many students in your school, not just a few students. And so universal approaches tend to be cost-effective and beneficial. They serve most vulnerable students. They also, as I said before, help you serve kids even if you don't identify them as being traumatized, and particularly can help you also serve young people if you don't know, because they and their caregivers may not want you to know that their parents are incarcerated for the reasons of stigma that Ann's already talked about. And the last slide, just to give you two examples of where things are being done universally. One is we are Mass Advocates for Children is right now implementing a public policy that has been created in Massachusetts where schools can choose to try to be trauma sensitive, and we have the good fortune of evaluating it right now. And there the effort is really creating a universal approach that is trauma sensitive. And if we're to go to Washington State, there is a model there that is being implemented by some schools and districts called compassionate schools, which again is based on the notion that there are many vulnerable students, and if we really want schools to succeed with every student, what we need to do is to create that caring, supportive place that builds the foundation that I've talked about. And now I have the great privilege of introducing Dwight, whom I've heard great things about before I met him today, and we can learn a lot from Dwight Davis.
This is Juliet D'Souza. I just want to jump in for one moment to acknowledge that we are aware of the technical difficulties that many of you are having seeing the slides. We do apologize profusely for that. We will be sending out the slides to all of you to make sure you do have access to all the incredible information we're hearing. And so we will try and fix it while you're on, but if not, you will receive the slides. Sorry for that interruption.
So I want to start by saying good afternoon to everyone. And I just want to acknowledge that David and Ann did such a wonderful job of setting this up. What I'm going to do is try to briefly talk through stress from a teacher/administrator perspective, and then focus the bulk of my time on keys to success. So I want to start by saying this. You know, everyone deals with stress. And everyone knows that there are differing levels of stress. For example, you know, getting to a place on time, passing a test, or even doing a webinar can cause stress. But there's a different type of stress, and that is called traumatic stress. And there are children who have to navigate traumatic stress, especially children living in difficult circumstances, whether it's, you know, the death of a loved one, you know, lack of food. Children may have to deal with abuse, or even an incarcerated parent. But this type of stress, it doesn't just happen to children. It actually gets inside of the child. It gets under their skin. It's something that they can't necessarily get rid of. And the thing about traumatic stress is that, and the more severe stress, which we would call toxic stress, I'm not going to talk about that, is that it locks us in what we call fight or flight. And as teachers and administrators and people who work within school buildings, this is very important, because oftentimes some people have the opinion that, well, you're just being too nice to that child. We just need to treat that child just like everyone else. But there is actually science behind this. And the science basically says that when a child experiences traumatic stress, the body releases a flood of the hormone cortisol, and Ann talked about this. And what happens is the brain is actually bathed in this hormone, and it affects the certain brain structures associated with learning. For example, the prefrontal cortex, which controls attention and executive functioning, the hippocampus, which is key for learning and memory, and the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional smoke detector. These three structures are extensively sensitive to stress. And so when a child experiences traumatic stress, it actually affects learning and the child's ability to learn. So the physical experience of traumatic stress is like being locked in a state of fight or flight, as I said before, and the body just can't calm down. Let me give you an example. You have a child who's sitting at a desk, and they broke their pencil. And you say, hey, that's okay, just sharpen another pencil. And the child just explodes, I don't want another pencil, right? That child could be experiencing traumatic stress. They're locked in this fight or flight, and the littlest thing could cause a tremendous eruption. Or you can have a child choose flight, and they may run out of the room, or they may cower under their desk. But these are the result of them experiencing this traumatic stress. Can we go to the next slide? And this brings me to my first point. I wish it were the case, but when children are dealing with traumatic stress, they don't leave home. They don't get to the school and say, okay, traumatic stress, I want you to go sit in the bushes. I'm going to go have an excellent day. When I come back, I'm going to put you back on and take you home. No. When children are dealing with traumatic stress, the stress comes into the building, it walks with the child, and then it participates in show and tell. Okay. So knowing this, it is important that school-based personnel and organizations that work with schools, it is important that all of the adults in the building must be equipped to deal with and help the students manage the stress. It is important that all individuals are equipped to teach children skills and coping mechanisms to deal with this. And the school leader in particular must be sensitive and aware and have a plan. The old cliche is definitely true. Those who fail to plan for stress plan to fail their students. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so here I have outlined a few things that I think need to be taken into account, especially at the school level. All right, so first and foremost, we must get to know our students. When students come into the building, there's so much that we do not know, right? Children entrust their children to come to us for 7 hours. They entrust us to feed them, but oftentimes there's a lot that we don't know. And a lot of times we can help a child by just spending time and talking to them. There is a rule that I use. It's called the 2-10 rule. So I have students that I know deal with difficult situations. I take 2 minutes out of my time for 10 days straight to talk to them. And that is sufficient enough time to develop a wonderful relationship with that child. And then the child feels comfortable to come and talk to me about anything. And this is important because what Ann said was that, the primary caregiver is a buffer. And if you are a teacher or if you're a school-based leader, you know that oftentimes children see the adults in the building as surrogate parents. So that's just one strategy. We have to get to know our students, get to know them, and be proactive about it. We have to reach out to families without prying. We don't want to pry into a family because then that causes suspicion, but we do want to be proactive. And we want to provide students opportunities like to even have lunch. Like we have something called lunch bunch. And so what that means is the teacher gives a pass to a series of students or one student, and those two, you have lunch with the child and you just talk. You talk about video games. You talk about math. You talk about the latest episode of their favorite television show. But these are just strategies to get to know the child because the antidote to stress is trust. And we want to build trusting relationships. So another thing that we want to do, which is number 2, is invest in your mental health team at your school. And I think over the years, school leaders investing in mental health teams has gotten a bad reputation, but this is something that is critical. At our school, we have an art therapist, we have social workers, we have a school counselor, we have so many people there to help our students. And this is very critical. because you need skilled individuals in the building able to deal with students who are not able to manage themselves. You need to have skilled individuals in the building who can teach your children skills and dispositions that will help them self-regulate. Which brings me to number 3 is building trusting relationships. And here are some strategies that we use at our school. We are huge proponents of home visits. And so our goal is that every teacher within our building will visit 75% of the students on their roster. And what this does is it changes the dynamic. Most often, parents and students, when they hear from their teachers, is often negative. So one way in which we try to switch this is we said, hey, let's go out and meet our parents. Let's go out and talk to them about their hopes and dreams for their children. Hey, let's just go build relationships. Because we know that if we can build relationships with the students and with the parents, then that will make the school more welcoming. That will make the school a more peaceful place. And then parents feel comfortable coming to the school and talking to teachers about, and talking to administrators about what's really going on in the home. As a teacher, I often implemented Saturday field trips. That was a way for me to help students get away from any type of trauma or dysfunction that they were dealing with. It was very inexpensive. Because we're in DC, we could just jump on the bus for free. We could go to the Capitol. We can go to the library. They could be introduced to different books, and I would bring them back. Oftentimes, people would sponsor us to even have lunch. But these are ways that you can help children like see their city as a way to get away from things or help them build skills that they need in order to to better themselves. The next thing I would say is that as a classroom teacher and as an administrator, it's very important that the classroom be safe and supportive. So, and I think David did a wonderful job of discussing this, because oftentimes teachers can be the biggest proponents of bias, right? Teachers definitely have to be aware, because sometimes you can trigger a child without even knowing you're triggering a child. Your tone of voice, the way in which you move about the classroom. And so what we do is we use something called Kagan strategies. And basically what that says is we try to use instructional approaches that facilitate collaboration, cooperation, trust, and independence. Oftentimes in the classroom, students have to turn and talk. They have to work with each other to solve a problem. The idea that 2 students can talk to one another and not be cheating is what we champion, because we want students to trust one another, to look at each other as resources, to look at the adult in the room as resources, and for the adult to be able to say, hey, I don't know the answer to all the questions, but let's figure it out together. Because those are skills and dispositions that students who deal with trauma really need. Another instructional approach that we try to implement is that we try to use something called bibliotherapy. And basically what that means is that we try to use books and the themes within books to help students understand what they are actually going through. So let me give you an example. Oftentimes in urban areas, you have a large proportion of students who are behind academically, and this could cause a lot of shame. And so there's a book called Thank You, Mr. Falker, which deals with a young lady who has difficulty reading despite the fact that her entire family can read. And so through using that book, we help students understand that, hey, some individuals have difficulty with reading, some individuals don't. But we want students to make the connection and understand that there are loving individuals in the building who are willing to help them navigate the difficulty. There are other books, Dear Mr. Henshaw, which talks about a young man named Lee Botts whose family is going through a difficult divorce. So we actually use the themes within the books to help students understand that other individuals have gone through the things that they've gone through, and that in going through these situations, there are always trusting adults or individuals who can help them and are willing to help them without bias, without feeling shame. And here's the thing. The good news is that despite the effects of trauma, despite the fact that trauma can cause an individual to have difficulty regulating themselves, the brain is actually very malleable, and it develops. So we can actually fix the effects of stress on a child's brain. We can actually help them overcome this. But the key is trust. The antidote to traumatic stress is trust. And it is incumbent upon school leaders to make sure that their buildings are filled with individuals who are equipped to deal with the stress, are loving and caring. They have structures in place that support the child, and most important, that they exude love and trust to all students so that they feel comfortable within the building. And at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Kendall, who's going to talk to us about his own personal experiences.
So Kendall, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. We're so glad you could join us today, and we really appreciate you sharing some of your personal experiences with us. So we thought we would start with you telling us just a little bit about yourself, and you can share what ages you were involved with foster care and then living with your grandmother, and when the incarceration of your mother happened, and then what you're doing right now.
Okay. Well, I experienced the foster care system for about a year and a half. I was 10 at the time, and then my grandmother gained custody of me at the age of 11 when I moved in with her, and I was entering the fifth grade. The fourth grade at the time, and I finished off fourth grade and then went on to the fifth grade, and that's when I entered U.S. Dream Academy at the fifth grade, and it wasn't until later on in high school that my mother was incarcerated. I was 17 at the time, and now I finished high school. I graduated June 14th of this year, and now I'm a freshman at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas.
That is so great, Kendall. We love to hear that all the things that you overcame and were able to get to college. When you were young and you had an absent and then an incarcerated parent, what were some of the challenges that you faced?
Some of the challenges that I faced were having no identity. I lacked motivation and purpose. I didn't have a sense of direction and where I was going or who I was going to be. No individuality. Didn't know how to express my feelings. Didn't really know how to express my ideas and concerns in a way that for people to understand.
And during your mother's absence and incarceration, was school a safe place for you to go and a place where you felt that you could grow and learn in a safe place?
At first school wasn't, because when I first came, during my mother's absence, school, it was okay. It was a safe place for the most part at that time because I had my mentors behind me and the staff was behind me. So if I needed anyone to talk to, they were there, or they noticed if I was acting out a certain way throughout, during my academic progress, if my progress decreased, or if I was failing in a certain course that I normally would be doing good at, then it would arise problems like that. And so immediately attention would be drawn to me, and my grades dropped because apparently something was wrong.
And so you started to mention your mentor, and earlier you mentioned your grandmother and I believe your aunt. Can you tell us about who has helped you to overcome some of these challenges? And was it your caregiver, the mentor, any staff specifically at your school, or other people?
Yes, my aunt was really a big part of that. When I had difficulty with work, she was always there to help me, and my grandmother especially, because she got me and my sister out of foster care and adopted us. And also having a mentor component was really beneficial because, I didn't really grow up with a father figure in my life. And so, having those men being a part of my life was very significant for me becoming the man that I am becoming. And my teachers, which were, once they figured out, where I came from and stuff like that, and they was there too. Like the principal, the founder of KIP, he just stood behind me, and they encouraged, and they, pushed me to go beyond my limits, to show me ways to overcome it, and how opportunities could be created from it. And so they just changed my perspective on things.
So we know that the Dream Academy uses trauma-informed approaches, which we heard from both David and Dwight talking about the importance of those at a school. Can you tell us how the Dream Academy was different from the schools you attended prior to that, and how their approaches helped you?
Okay. Their difference was the mentor component. Dream Academy having the mentor component was very beneficial because, like I said, you have that male figure to come into your life. Going through what I was going through, I wasn't very much of an open person, didn't really trust nobody, wasn't big on even talking about what I was going through because I just felt like you just don't talk about that. Like talking about it, kind of made it worse or whatever, but having that open, and they also had what they called an open circle. All the kids come down and get into the open circle, and you express your feelings. And then once you hear what you let out was inside that you've been holding in, it actually feels, good letting it out. And then you also see those other kids around that's also going through similar situations. So it's not just you. You come to find out that you're not alone in this, that you're not the only one going through these situations. So for me to see that I'm not the only one, and there's also other kids going through this, it was like, wow.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be helpful knowing you're not alone.
Yeah.
So there are teachers and school staff members on this call, as well as other people who work with youth in a variety of settings and environments at different organizations. What would you like to tell them about how they can help students who have a parent who is incarcerated, and how they can help students feel safe and comfortable and nurtured at school?
I say create after-school programs would be great for those kids, the students, getting them to open up. A lot of kids hold in those emotions and those things that they are going through, and you just figure out a good way for them to get it out, for them a way to express themselves, and let the child know that they're not alone, and if you're able to relate to them in any way, and motivate them, that would be good also. And also,
Okay. Do you have some ideas for ways they can assist children of incarcerated?
I could assist them by
Kendall, are you still there?
it just paused for a second. I didn't know what happened.
Oh, okay.
I was talking, but I guess y'all didn't hear me. But yeah, you can assist them by, creating those after-school programs, letting the child know that they're not alone, and getting them, just really being able to open up, showing them ways to take their situations and create opportunities with them. That what they're going through is not. It don't have to be bad. You don't have to consider it bad. It can actually be a good thing in some ways.
Yeah.
You don't have to let your circumstances hold you down.
That is really helpful, Kendall, and we appreciate so much you sharing your story with us, your personal information, and what you went through. Right now, I think we're going to go over to question and answers, and my colleague Simone Gonsalén is going to facilitate that. We've received questions via email. We've also received some in the chat box during this webinar. So we're going to start with a few questions, and if folks want to continue to send questions in through the chat box, that would be welcome. And we do apologize again for the technical difficulties. We will be sharing those slides and the recording afterwards. So now I'll turn it over to Simone.
Thanks, Juliet. I appreciate that. And with over 600 participants, we have gotten quite a few questions, as Juliet said. The first thing I wanted to do is to mention to our presenters who will be answering these responses, as we've gotten questions in from the participants, they've asked for you to be as specific as possible in giving suggestions. Sure. So that was one of the things that we've gotten on from a couple of participants, yeah, especially around strategies. So what I'm going to do is identify the question and ask one of you to start the ball rolling with a response. Everybody does not have to respond to every question, but I figured I would go ahead and make the selection. The first person, then as you want to add to that conversation, please feel free to do so. So the first question, I'm going to start with Anne. And the first question is, when working with very young children, say children under 5 years of age, what are the best strategies in supporting their emotional needs when they have a parent who is incarcerated?
So,
and yeah, perfect. We can hear you. Perfect. Thank you.
You can hear me?
Yes. Coming in loud and clear.
Okay. For very young children, the supports are going to begin with and emanate from their primary caregivers. And so involving the caregivers in a process is really important. So I'm just going to suggest a couple of things that apply to very young kids but also older kids. When I talked about universal outreach, I meant universal to children of incarcerated parents in the sense that not just looking at one zip code or one particular demographic. But so if you did a training, for instance, in children of incarcerated parents, and you sent it home in a newsletter to your preschool program or your school that you participated in that, and then followed that up with maybe an announcement that there's a new picture book being put into the library, or a new book, Visiting Day, or which is by Jacqueline Woodson, or perhaps Daniel Beatty's new book, Knock Knock. And those are both for very young children. And then you announce that. And then maybe a little bit later, you could maybe suggest that there might be an evening discussion on managing children of incarcerated parents' feelings for very young children. The same process could be true for older kids and families, but with very young kids, to start with caregivers, I think, would be really significant. And also the idea of the bibliotherapy and using books. So a question I always ask programs for young kids is, would you put those books in your daycare center or your kindergarten, even if you didn't know you had children of incarcerated parents in there, and so that it sensitizes the entire group of kids to the fact that this is a reality. One example, a school in Chicago, a preschool in Chicago, who does mystery readers for their pre-K and kindergarten, and the kids don't know who the mystery readers are. It's somebody from their family usually. The grandmom told the school that this child's dad was incarcerated, and he belonged to a book on tape program in the facility where he could read books that got sent home to his child. So they used dad as the mystery reader. It really created almost a whole year-long process of the kids started writing letters to this child's dad in prison, and it made the little boy feel really comfortable talking about it to peers as well as to staff.
Thank you, Ann. David, would you want to add?
Sure.
Ann provided?
Yeah. I think thank you, Ann. And I think if we listen to Kendall, and Kendall mentioned the role of his aunt, and at one point the role of his grandparent, I think it's really important to realize that there are often people in children's families who are not incarcerated who are there to support. And I think that to reach out to them, and at the same time, it is very important, if schools can, to try to develop ways to reach out and to engage the incarcerated parent. And it may be, it involves being family-driven with them. And it also involves, in some cases, helping them know how can they handle the situation well, what can they say to their children, how can they support their children. In a federally supported center that Simone runs, I remember a presentation that Simone's team had brought together from schools who were really working with, I should say institutions that were working with incarcerated parents to support them in making connections to their children. Well, while it would be nice if most jails and prisons would do that, we can't expect that right now. What schools ought to do is to do the opposite and make that outreach.
Good, David. Thank you. I appreciate that. Dwight, we have a question I'd like to pose to you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
How can educators serve as critical partners in making a difference in the lives of incarcerated parents? Not the children, but the parents.
I think, and this kind of goes back to something that Ann and David said, I think oftentimes, certainly as a teacher, I was guilty of this, is that sometimes we are not aware of the biases that we kind of hold. And I think sometimes, this is not all educators, but so belief systems are like oxygen, right? Like oxygen is there, we can't see it, but we breathe it. And sometimes like we have these biases that we are just not aware of. And I think that the most critical thing that we can do, number one, is just try to examine ourselves and try to be aware of them. Because oftentimes, if a child is misbehaving, oftentimes, some teachers may say, oh, that's just a bad child, right? And the child is not bad. The child may be dealing with something very difficult. And because that child is dealing with something difficult, the child has difficulty handling that. And, what then happens is, the child becomes bad, then the parents become bad, instead of the entire family just dealing with a very difficult situation. And then, so if we're able to say, okay, there's no such thing as a bad child, and that, children are dealing with traumatic stress, just like adults are dealing with traumatic stress, then the question becomes, so how do I help? And then once you get to that place of how can I help, then it becomes like, so how do I extend myself? Like, so how do I reach out to this parent? How do I reach out to the auntie, or how do I reach out to the uncle? So one thing that Kendall said that I thought was right on point was that he said that the after-school programs were so beneficial. And, at our school, we have multiple children who are dealing with an incarcerated parent. And so the first thing I try to do is I say, okay, here are my best teachers who are working after school. How can I get these particular children into our after-school program so that they have more time with these positive individuals? Some of them are males, some of them are females. They're going to get a certain type of support. This will also support the grandparent or the auntie or the uncle who has to pick them up. So then it becomes, well, how do we support the entire family instead of seeing the child as something negative or seeing the parent as something negative? But then it becomes like, so how do I provide supports via the school that will buttress this child a bit more against the stress that they're dealing with? So I think those are very practical things. If a parent is gone, someone has to help out. So how can the school extend its reach a little bit? How can it extend this? How can we get a child enrolled in a particular program that goes a little bit longer? How can we, are there other partners that we work with that can provide food, that can provide this, provide clothes? So, the different things that can be provided. But I think those are just very practical levels, practical things that can be done. And I hope that answers the question.
Can I add to that, Simone?
Go ahead. Yeah, please do.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of good research that says that parental identity is really necessary for reentry success with your child for reunification. And so that sense of parental identity, meaning I feel like a parent while I'm locked up, is really hard to maintain, in some cases to achieve for the first time even, but to maintain it if you've had it before you were incarcerated. And that parental identity is, it's about the everyday things. So to the extent that we can send report cards to the incarcerated parent, can send them the notes home, we've had tons of really good programs around the country that have the incarcerated parent reading the same book as the child is required to read. Help mentor programs that are helping kids keep journals of what to say on the phone when they talk to that parent, ideas for things that they can keep track of. But all of that requires basically the caregivers' cooperation. They're the gatekeepers. And so often one of the big roadblocks is that the caregivers are not really in the best relationship with the incarcerated parent, and they may not give permission or even the information about the incarcerated parent. So again, reaching out to the caregivers and helping to provide them with information. And one more thing, none of this can happen if the child isn't told the truth about their parent's incarceration, which is another really common roadblock. And so having materials available in the school and also sending them to the incarcerated parent when you can about how to talk to children about parental incarceration. And so those things could be available to both the caregiver and the incarcerated parent to maintain that connection.
Okay. Thank you, Ann. I appreciate that. There is another question, and Ann, we're going to toss this one to you if you don't mind. Is it better for the child to have school personnel know of their parent's incarceration, or is it better that the family or parent caregiver advocate for the child's needs with the school? What has been your experience there? And it might be one where it's different for each child, but
yeah.
I wanted to go ahead and throw that question out there.
Can you clarify, Simone, that second part of the question? Is it better for them for the school staff to know, or
I believe what the participant is saying is, or is it better for the caregiver to navigate or work with the school staff and just advocating for the kid, for the child in identifying his or her needs?
Without revealing that there's an incarcerated parent.
That's correct. That's correct.
You know, it's the universal question for this work, and there's not a lot of research that helps us except in borrowing from other bodies of knowledge that when parents have cancer, when they're getting divorced, when you're moving to a new home, it's better to tell kids the sooner the better in small doses, weaving it into everyday conversation rather than clobbering them with it over their head the night before or the week before. And I think that that's really true. As a therapist, it's true for this topic as well, that when kids know a little bit at a time, over the period of time, they do better. We need more research about that, but we know that anxiety is diminished when kids know the truth about things, so that would apply. But the point is that if this is a complicated topic with lots of shame and lots of anger, and so again, having materials that in the school that help parents, I always say schools can be very beneficial in helping parents come to that decision about truth-telling, but it should be the caregivers and the parents that talk to the kids about it, not the school, if that's what the questioner was asking. And it raises the issue, a huge issue, that confidentiality is really important about this, and families will talk about it when they can, when they feel safe. And so lots of systems are asking for collaboration, child welfare and corrections and law enforcement saying we should notify the school. And we as advocates are saying, please don't. Let the caregivers notify the school unless there's an urgent emergency issue. Because until school personnel are really trained to deal with their biases, it really could be used against the child. And the Lair et al. Information and study really helps us with that. So I would say that it's best for families to advocate it's best for schools to create an atmosphere of trust and safety so families tell the schools what's going on and that information is used to support children rather than to sort of identify them for services, for instance. And how we ask the questions of families matter. So when we say, is somebody in your family incarcerated, it's really different than having a poster of the Sesame Street materials up in the counselor's office that says, if incarceration of a family member is an issue for your family, let us know because we can help. So how you ask, supporting truth-telling, and no, there's really no research that says that, but I think that sort of clinical and conventional wisdom says that kids who know the truth are less anxious.
Thanks, Ann. We've got another question, and I think you kind of touched on this in that response around the staff within the school, such as guidance counselors, social workers, administrators. Have you experienced quality professional development for guidance staff, administrators, in helping vulnerable children, including children of incarcerated parents? Are there any type of professional development opportunities that any of the speakers are aware of that might be able to help school staff in really addressing the needs of a child that's been traumatized? David?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, and I think it's the point that all of us have made, but particularly Dwight, is the fact that teachers need, and other school staff need to understand about trauma and how it manifests itself, and the importance of doing the types of things that Dwight talked about, in terms of the fact that every time one responds to an evocation in a way that tends to be negative and counter-aggressive is a risk of re-traumatizing. And even if you're not re-traumatizing, you're making that child more aversive to other adult intervention. And so people need to really understand that they have to understand how trauma manifests itself in the behaviors of young people. But I want to add the fact that that's not the only piece. They also have to be aware of how knowledge of a child and a child's background can contribute to a whole set of low or lowered expectations and other reactions that may not be helpful. And so I very much agree with Ann's hypothesis, as she said, about wanting everyone to be transparent about what things are. But what that really requires also is providing professional development so that we develop a growth mindset in teachers, not just children, that they can look at a child of an incarcerated parent or someone else who's experienced trauma and know that the literature on resilience consistently demonstrates that many people overcome adversity. They overcome adversity because they have resilience supporting environments, resilience supporting adults around them. But to know that you cannot look at a child as fixed. And I will also tell you, as both the parent and the grandparent of children who've had incarcerated parents, that there are strengths in parents who are incarcerated, and what adults need to know is enough to look at a parent who is incarcerated as someone who happens to be incarcerated, who happens to be a parent, and also to know the data around incarceration that makes it much more likely, if you look a certain way, that you will be incarcerated for behavior that if you don't look a certain way, you will not be. And similarly about issues of class and language. And I bet Dwight has something he could add to this.
And I think, both Ann and David, you're so, your response is so profound. But this takes me back to something I said earlier about home visits. So I just want to paint a quick picture. Okay, so let's say, you are a parent who lives in my neighborhood, Trinidad. There's a very low SES, so it's pretty impoverished. And your experiences with the educational system have not been the best, although you may know some who've had great experiences. You didn't have great experiences with your teachers. Now you have a child. You had your child. You were much younger than you wanted to be. You had the best intentions, but you had a child young. And so now you have to send your child to the same school that you went to, and you had all these negative experiences. But somehow, some way, the adults in the building are just expecting you to trust them wholeheartedly, right? That's not a reality. This is why home visits at our school were so important, because what it demonstrated to the parents was that, hey, there's something different happening at this school. It's so profound and it's so different that we are coming to you. We value you. We want to come to your home. We want to learn. We want to know what you know about your child, because guess what? You are the expert, and we need to learn from you. That is a radical shift. And so I think, once we started to implement the home visits, the parents started to respond to us and respond to me totally differently. When I would call on the phone, instead of it ringing and going to voicemail, the parent would pick up on the first ring. Hey, Mr. Davis, what's going on? Did something go wrong? No. I just want to tell you your child had a great day. So it starts with really being very intentional about letting parents know and letting students know that we can be trusted, and that, you know, the experiences that you know, because the past can be very dangerous, right? In many ways, we live our today through the lens of the past. And so schools really have to do a great job of messaging and demonstrating to parents that the school is a very trusting environment, and that the adults are worthy, that the adults can be trusted. That's critical.
So the last question that I'd like to say, thanks so much, David and Dwight, is for Kendall. Kendall, are you still with us?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. So we've heard Ann, David, and Dwight talk about this trusting, caring adult, right? I mean, they've all covered that in their conversation today. What are the characteristics of some caring, trusting mentors or teachers in your background and your experiences that have really helped you overcome some challenges as a young man, as an adolescent, as a young adult?
Well, they really show a sense of gratitude, and they open themselves to the mentee or of a child. You can, like a child can tell instantly if the adult mean well, or if the adult doesn't mean well, you know, because the child has those natural instincts like that. And so it's how the adult approaches the child, and if they can relate to the child really, and if they are open to the child. Usually if they're open, the child is willing to open themselves as well. And they show that, and the child feels that, you know, that they're comfortable with them, and the child can tell that they really are caring, and they're showing gratitude. And though I think those are the two biggest things that helped me. If the adult was caring and just showed a sense, it wasn't like a sense of sympathy. It was more of a sense that they really showed interest in my problems and wanted to really help me to push me forward.
Thanks, Kendall. We appreciate that response.
Simon, could I just add to that and loop it back to the other question about professional development, is that there's 3 categories of professional development that I think would be really helpful. One is what David's talking about you know, the overall trauma and, you know, trauma-informed practice and understanding how all of the things that impact kids' lives impact them at school. But the second is specifically about children of incarcerated parents, because, for instance, a math teacher could add a problem into her, you know, into her work, saying if people were driving 25 miles an hour and it took them 3 hours to get to the prison to visit their mom, you know, how fast were they going? That kind of problem that a teacher actually did put into her curriculum, and a child that she had no clue had an incarcerated parent came up to her and said, you know, hey, Miss So-and-so, when we go, we take the bus, so how fast does that go? And so all of a sudden now there's an entree to conversation. So the second category is specific things that can be done to help make it easier and safer for kids of incarcerated parents. And then the third is professional development around communicating with kids to help them to talk without peppering them with questions, with being respectful of confidentiality about a lot of different issues. So I think looking for all of those types of professional development that support what Kendall was saying about supports as well would be important.
Thank you, Ann. And I'd like to give David 30 seconds for a few final comments, and then Dwight, if you would pick up right after David, if you don't mind.
Yeah. First, both children and parents of incarcerated who are incarcerated have strengths that we need to build. And even if they're struggling, we need to build those strengths. And second, in addition to the goodwill that adults who are working in schools have in general, we have to build their proficiencies and their capacity to care. And that includes providing them with support and understanding that this is not easy and that they have strengths that they can build to rise to the occasion. Dwight?
Yes, and it's just something that is very simple. The antidote to stress and trauma is trust. And so until we understand that, you know, we're not helping children. And so the most critical thing is that we must get to a place where we can examine our biases and acknowledge that we have them and work towards trust, because every child, no matter, every adult, every parent, no matter who it is, they love their children.
Well, Dwight, David, Kendall, and Ann, thank you so much for the Q&A section and also sharing your resources and your expertise with us on the webinar. I'll turn things over to Juliet, my colleague, who will finish things up for the day.
Yep, we just want to conclude for today, and thank you so much for joining us. We do apologize for the technical issues, and since some of you can't see it on your screen, I'll read out our email address, youth.gov@air.org. Feel free to email us with any further questions that you have, and you can visit youth.gov/COIP for more information and resources. This webinar will be archived there, along with the tip sheet for teachers and other resources. There's also a listserv specifically for issues related to children of incarcerated parents. If you're interested in that listserv, you can let us know so that you can receive updates and information on new products, resources, and events like this one. And finally, I do want to thank Ann, David, Dwight, and Kendall for being with us today and sharing such valuable information. And their contact information is available on the screen. If you can't see it, again, you can email us youth.gov@air.org. Thanks so much to the more than 500 people that stuck it out, even with issues with the slides. Thanks so much. Have a great day.